Good evening, it's 6 o'clock and I'll call our meeting to order. Good evening everyone and welcome to the Mooresville Planning Board meeting. Our purpose tonight is to review zoning and land use requests and make advisory recommendations to the Board of Commissioners. Our procedure process would be the staff will present the background information and give recommendations on the request. The applicant developer will then present any information they wish relating to the request. The board at that time may ask any questions of staff or the applicant or developer at any time. And at the conclusion of the presentations, the floor will be open for public comment. During the public comment, we ask all speakers to give their name and address when called to the podium. And the rules we would ask you to abide by are a 3-minute time limit, only speak once per period, no banking or donating time to others. Please direct comments to the full board, not one member, and no discussion between the public and the board. This time, we'd like to ask you to silence all cell phones. And I'll ask us to stand for our Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Mr. Robertson, may I ask if you would please return thanks for us?
Father, we thank you for another opportunity to serve the citizens of our great town. Pray that each action we take tonight would be in the best interest of all. We pray that you would look down upon our nation and heal the coronavirus and all the other political scandals that's going on, and give us a new spirit as we sing in Christ's name. Amen.
Thank you, Mr. Robertson. Do we have any postponement or withdrawal requests?
No, sir.
Has everyone had a chance to review the minutes? And if so, do I have a motion to accept?
So moved.
Do we have a second? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Thank you very much. Any old business?
No, sir.
Our new business is item CCC 2020-18, which is 221 Charlotte Highway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is conditional rezoning request 2020-18 in regards to 2221 Charlotte Highway. The applicant is Prestige Development. The owners are Vicky Morrow and Timothy Ested. The request is conditional to rezone from single-family residential 2, to single-family residential 5 with conditions. And as you can see, we have the location map, the vicinity map up there, so you can see where it is within the town. The site is 11.02 acres, obviously located along Charlotte Highway. Its current use is single-family residential. The access to the property is along Charlotte Highway, and currently it is outside the corporate limits in the ETJ. It is currently zoned single-family residential 2. It also is within the corridor overlay. Some by right uses in R2 are single-family dwellings, duplexes, manufactured homes, schools, government, religious, civic, parks, farms, and stables. And the density is 2 units per acre. The future land use designation, it actually has 2. The one Mooresville denotes this as an employment center, which supports various types of employment uses, including offices and light production facilities, along with supporting retail, restaurants, and services. The primary uses are light production facility, business incubator, and warehousing, with a desired density of 4 to 16 units per acre. And this is the narrative in the One Mooresville Plan about employment center. It also denotes it in the village center node, which includes an integrated mix of commercial, office, hospitality, and residential uses. The primary uses in a village center node are commercial retail on the first floor, multi-story office, and multifamily on the upper floors, The desired density is 8 to 30 units per acre. And then this is the context of the village center node. So this plan specifically is for 35 single-family homes. That comes out to a density of 3.18 units per acre. A few things about the plan. They have 3.8 acres of designated open space, which is greater than the 20% requirement. Their impervious is at 70%, and they are only covering 41%, so they are well under the maximum. All of the internal roads will be public and maintained by the town, and there was no TIA required for this request. So this, as you can see, this portion right here is what we're that's my computer. So the portion at the top is what we're talking about today, but down at the bottom, that's the Sequia forest development. There were 2 requests to rezone. One was in 2019 and one was in 2020 to go from R2 to R3. So the Sequoia Forest Phase 1, which is what was below on the last slide, went through on December 2nd, 2019 and February 3rd, 2020. There were amendments to the future character and land use map for those rezonings. They went from employment center to neighborhood residential. So the difference between this request and the ones from before is that staff is concerned about protecting the viability of the village center node because of the future I-77 interchange that's going to be along Cornelius Road. We are expecting that there is to be great commercial development down that corridor, and so staff is concerned about maintaining that specific area designated for commercial development. Section 2.3.18 of the zoning ordinance outlines 10 factors that should be considered when looking at a map amendment. Because this is the first time that we've had this in the presentation, I'm going to go through every single one, but in the future we'll go through a summary. First is whether and the extent to which the proposed amendment is consistent with the comprehensive land use plan and any relevant adopted small area plans. The proposed amendment is not consistent with the comprehensive land use plan as it calls for employment center and village center node, and the plan is entirely single-family residential. Whether in the extent to which there are change conditions that require an amendment, there are no conditions that require an amendment on this plan. Whether in the extent to which the proposed amendment addresses a demonstrated community need. The proposed amendment provides single-family detached dwelling units, which is needed in the community. Whether and the extent to which the proposed amendment is compatible with existing and proposed uses surrounding the subject land and is the appropriate zoning district for the land. The proposed amendment is compatible with existing uses as the properties are adjacent to residential uses on all sides and it is an extension of an approved residential plan. However, it should be emphasized again that the Mooresville Plan designates these properties and parcels to the north heading down Charlotte Highway as an employment center and village center node. Whether in the extent to which the proposed amendment would result in a logical and orderly development pattern or deviate from logical and orderly development patterns. The proposed amendment would result in a logical and orderly development pattern as it is a continuation of a previously approved residential development. Whether in the extent to which the proposed amendment would encourage premature development. The amendment will not encourage premature development as it is a continuation of a previously approved development. Whether in the extent to which the proposed amendment would result in strip or ribbon commercial development, it will not, as it is a residential development. Whether in the extent to which the proposed amendment will result in the creation of an isolated zoning district, unrelated to adjacent and surrounding zoning districts, the proposed amendment will not result in that, as it is adjacent to surrounding zoning districts because it is consistent with the adjacent Mooresville Plan. The proposed amendment will not result in the creation of an isolated zoning district unrelated to adjacent and surrounding zoning districts. Whether in the extent to which the proposed amendment will result in significant adverse impacts on the property values of surrounding lands, it will not result in significant adverse impacts on the surrounding property. And finally, whether in the extent to which the proposed amendment would result in significantly adverse impacts on the natural environment, including but not limited to water, air, noise, stormwater management, wildlife, vegetation, wetlands, and the natural functioning of the environment. will not result in significantly adverse impacts on the natural environment, as the site does not appear to contain any wetlands, floodplain, forest areas, or any environmentally sensitive features. So of the 10 factors that should be considered, it only does not meet 1. It meets 9 out of the 10. So the next steps to be taken on this request is it will go before town board action on October 5th. They will have to go for annexation, which will go before the town board. There has been a utility extension request that was approved by the town board this month. They will have to go through construction drawing approvals, land disturbance permits, and building permits, all of which will be facilitated through town staff and Iredell County. So in conclusion, staff does recommend denial of the rezoning request because it is inconsistent with the Mooresville Plan. However, it should be emphasized that it does meet 9 of the 10 factors to be considered as outlined in 2.3.18. At this time, I'll take any questions you may have for me.
Thank you, Ms. Blake, and thank you again for the detail you provided us in this, since there are a couple of different approaches to consider on that. I would ask the board for any questions for staff, but before you ask questions, I'd just like to revisit, please. Make sure that your mic is on, you're speaking clearly into it, since we're recording the sessions, and want to make sure that we capture everybody's remarks clearly. Any questions for Ms. Black?
I have one. What's the difference for this, considering everything's R3 around it, what's the difference or what's the purpose for this being R5?
The applicant is here to speak a little bit more in depth about all of that, but I believe it's to increase the density.
Any other questions from council staff? Not, then thank you, Ms. Black, and I'd like to ask the applicant if you have a presentation, please.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman. My name is Robert Davis. I reside at 1197 Ivy Church Road in Macon, North Carolina.
Thank you, sir. You may need to pull that mic just a little closer. I can hear you, but we just want to make sure that the recording is clear. Thank you.
Did you hear my residence, sir?
Did we capture that? Or if you don't mind repeating, just.
Yes, sir. Robert Davis, Mr. Chairman, and planning board members, 1197 Ivy Church Road, Macon, North Carolina, 28650.
Thank you, sir.
I represent Prestige in tonight's matter. Becca has provided us with a wonderful presentation, so I don't think I need to delve too much into that. I'll simply summarize and be as brief as I can. But before I begin, one planning board member raised the question about R3 to R5. It's important to recognize the distinction is essentially buffers. This developer, Prestige, considered all existing properties around it, did its best not to make a connection through existing residential onto the current highway path. So if it were left under its current presentation, the Mooresville Plan, commercial would have to come through residential to connect, or oppose the church driveway across the street, which I think would be a problem. So it was a great question, sir. To summarize, I think the most important things are, as Becca pointed out, it is compatible with the existing uses. Number two, it's a continuation of what's previously been approved and amended under Mooresville Plan. And we are currently under construction of that adjacent parcel. Number three, there are 3 sides to residential. Number 4, even though a TIA is not required, 35 homes put minimal, if any, pressure on the current building. And number 5, this development is, I believe, and I believe the applicant believes, as well as maybe some of staff, it is a logical conclusion to your current Mooresville Plan, meaning that it provides a bookend of residential where you make that transition into other uses. Joining me this evening with the applicant is Albert Schellinger of Darden Engineering. So both of us will be available for any questions planning board may have. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
Are there any questions from the board? Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that. With that, I will open the public comment section and ask if there's anyone from the public to speak to this matter. Once again, I'll check to see if there's anyone to speak to this matter from the public. If not, then I'll close the public comment section. Ask if there's any additional discussion on the board. If not, then do we have a motion on the matter?
Comment. We spend a lot of time, effort, and money on the One Mooresville Plan, which makes you not want to change that because of so much effort that's been put into it. And then you look at it and see how far away it is from the intersection and interchange. You wonder how long it's going to be before Cornelius Road is developed. And these folks want to sell their property, and it could be 10 years before any business ever wants to locate there. So it makes it a hard decision to decide whether we should change it or not change it. And that's just a comment.
Thank you for your comment, Mr. Martin. Any additional comments from the board? Then I would ask again, do we have a motion to approve or to deny?
Mr. Chairman, I move that we approve this zoning request.
We have a motion from Mr. Abraham to approve. Is there a second?
Second.
Second from Mr. Robertson. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? With that, the motion carries, and we would recommend to the town board approval from the planning board. Thank you very much. Oh, forgive me. With our new process, I would ask, as you made the motion, if you would please read the statement of reasonableness and compliance that goes with that, Mr. Abraham, and then we'll vote on that.
The zoning amendment is approved and is reasonable and in the public interest because the property is surrounded on three sides by existing residential uses. Further residential development would not have an adverse impact on the property value of the area and will simply continue the pattern of existing development. In addition to approving this zoning amendment, this approval is also deemed an amendment to the town's comprehensive plan use plan. The change in conditions the planning board has taken into account recommending amendment to the zoning ordinance to meet the development needs of the community are as follows. There is a high demand for additional single-family residential dwellings in this area as indicated by the high demand and short stays of real estate listed on the market, and an amendment to the town's comprehensive plan would assist in meeting the residential needs of the community. Further, the board has considered all zoning map amendment standards and determined that there is little likelihood that the area will transition to commercial uses given the overwhelming residential use of the surrounding area. Amendment to the town's comprehensive land use plan from employment center and village center node to neighborhood residential will be consistent and harmonious with existing development and will result in a logical and orderly development plan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abraham. With the statement being read, then do I have a motion to accept the statement of reasonableness and compliance?
I make that motion.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you very much. Motion carries. Again, we'll be recommending that to the town board for approval. Our next item on the agenda is administrative. We have, I think, director of staff comments, and then we have transportation training.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, board, just briefly, just to kind of give you an update on where we are with the update to the Unified Development Ordinance. The consultant recently submitted a annotated outline where they took into account the existing, the ordinance the way it's laid out today, and they made proposals about the layout of the ordinance going forward. The staff is currently reviewing those, and we'll be making any edits to those. We'll get those back to the consultant. Once we get those edits back to the consultant, we'll probably bring that back before this body for an explanation so that you can see it, since you are serving as advisory to that. And then once they get the annotated outline in place, they will begin the actual drafting of the new ordinance. So I just wanted to kind of give you that update as to where we are. So like I said, we should be seeing something on that relatively soon. The other item that I would, as you stated, we're pleased to have this evening our transportation engineer, Camilla Weckerman, and she is going to talk to you this evening about transportation impact analysis, otherwise known as TIAs, the town's policy on those, how they're determined, the kind of process we work through with those, and also some general statements about transportation roadways. So with your indulgence, I'll turn it over to Ms. Weckerman.
Well, we thank you very much. We appreciate your time setting this up.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. My name is Cammie Weckerly. I'm the transportation engineer for the town. And some of you may have seen this presentation before, although it was 2 years ago, so maybe give time for a refresher. But please feel free to stop me at any time during the presentation if you have any questions or comments along the way. So this is just an overview of what I'm going to be covering in my presentation. I'll walk you through each step of the TIA process and go through an example. The example is the parking lot subdivision. It's right across from where the operations center is from the town. It's up near Connector Road, Cornelius on Highway 21. Actually, right across the street from where the rezoning case was for tonight. So the town has had a formal TIA policy and procedure since 2007. Under our policy, the developers will hire a traffic engineering consultant who will write their TIA for the development, and they can use any TIA consultant as long as they're licensed and certified in practicing TIAs and capacity analysis. And any development, regardless of rezoning, must complete a TIA if their proposal meets the minimum criteria of our policy. The town requires a TIA if you meet the 500 daily trips or 100 peak hour trips. If we didn't have our own policy, it would default to NCDOT's policy, and their minimum threshold would be 3,000 daily trips. So, for example, the Starbucks on 150 having to complete a TIA because they have a drive-through under DOT's policy only until a commercial development is more of the size of the Food Lion would they be required to conduct a TIA. So with a residential subdivision, that would equate to 45 homes would be the minimum threshold under the town's minimum thresholds for requiring a TIA. A subdivision about the size of Cherry Grove, which is about 325 lots, that would be the minimum under DOT's, or near the minimum under DOT's thresholds for requiring a TIA. So this slide just shows all the steps of our process, starting with sketch plan. Sketch plan is a very general concept. It's a high-level overview of the site, and the purpose is really just to provide town staff with the ability to look at where the site access would be, what the internal circulation would look like, number of units, land use, things like that, making sure that overall it complies with general town ordinances, and that there wouldn't be any major changes needed to the plan that may affect the TIA, such as number of site accesses, location of site accesses, things like that. But each sketch plan is different, and it varies in level of detail. There is a minimum, there's a minimum requirements to what needs to be on the sketch plan. Sometimes a little bit more detail is provided, but it varies. So once the sketch plan is far enough along and staff is comfortable with it, we will set up a TIA scoping meeting. Attendees at the TIA scoping meeting include town staff, NCDOT staff, the applicant, and sometimes their civil engineer for the site, and then the developer's TIA consultant. The purpose of the plan, or the purpose of the scoping meeting would be to make everyone aware of the proposed plan. Sometimes this is the first time that town staff and DOT are discussing the project together. Sometimes it's the first time that DOT has seen it, and we're kind of bringing it to their attention and involving them in our process. So this is the example of the Parkmont subdivision site plan. We'll look at, verify the location, that there's two access points, what the land uses are, whether or not they're planning on phasing any of their development, things like that. And then we'll move to identifying the study locations. So depending on here, in this example, you'll see the star indicates where the development is, and the study locations are in blue. These are the locations that were determined in the scoping meeting to be the most impacted intersections. And then the next step would be to determine what the no-build base conditions would be. So this would be if the development was never built, what is still going to be happening out in this area. So for this example, there was another approved development that already went through the process. That one was called Mooresville East subdivision, the approved development. And then there was also the connector road that was not built yet, so that would be considered a committed transportation improvement. So that would be in the no-build condition happening in the future, whether or not this development went forward or not. And then we'll also note any applicable planning documents. Since we developed the Mooresville Plan, all of those corridor studies and small area plans were kind of brought into the Mooresville Plan. That those types of studies, or the Mooresville Plan and the transportation plan, those will be considered in the scope as well. And then the outcome of that is our memorandum of understanding, or our scope. So at that point, the consultant, they have everything they need to begin their study. I will just pause real quick because I'll start getting into more of the technical details, so I just want to pause here and see if there's any questions at this point.
I got a quick question.
Sure.
So, TIAs are done when school's in session, so we're in a unique time where school is sort of in session. There's not a lot, as many cars on the road. So are we doing TIAs, or are we getting the answers that we need now?
On my next slide, I think I'll cover that question. So if you're okay with that, I'll at the bottom there you see a little asterisk. So I'll continue. So the next step is data collection for seeing what is out there and what we know. So typically for a residential subdivision, you look at the AM and PM peak hours are usually the same because they're based on the adjacent roadways and those peak hours. And it usually has to be on a weekday when school is in session, and there's not any holidays. So nothing, no accounts that would be considered off or atypical that would affect the outcome of the study. Sometimes for commercial developments, for example, like a fast food facility or something, there might be a weekend, midday, or some other peak hour that would be required to be included because the peak hours for that use would be not during the typical AM and PM peaks. And then our normal policy is that existing counts that are used need to at least be a year old. However, NCDOT has put out a memo, and municipalities have been asked to work with developers and applicants for TIs to work with them and allow historical counts. There is a couple different ways they could do that. DOT has a database online that they have, when they do any counts, they upload them there that consultants can access. And the town, because of all the TIs that we've done, we have counts that from other TIs that we're able to share with anyone that comes in with a new development. Any counts that we have, we provide to them. I think the key is when does that COVID time end? A little unsure, just don't know when traffic patterns will return to what they were before. They may never, so at some point, maybe that COVID rule will end up going away and it'll be a new normal, I don't know, but for right now, they're allowed to use historical data. And in areas where there's not a lot of development happening and may not be any counts from DOT or from the town, it makes it a little bit more difficult to try and figure that out. So we have had one or two that have had that situation, and I think we're still trying to figure out how we can move those forward, maybe conduct the study, and then later on when counts do return back to normal, just doing some sort of amendment to check and see if those impacts were actually accurate or not. So does that answer your question? So this is an example of the count sheet. This is at the Highway 21 and Cornelius / Connector Road intersection. And then the traffic consultant, once he gets all of his data, will move into modeling. Synchro is, you haven't heard of it before, it's the tool that most transportation professionals use for conducting studies and modeling the traffic, putting in all the input, and then pressing the button and let it do what it does. And then there are some industry accepted analysis standards, so not a whole lot of room for variation on how the modeling gives you a result, because any of the assumptions that could be adjusted to vary that output have been laid out in the all of these standards that you see here. So in modeling, as I mentioned before, there's 3 different scenarios. In my slide here, so in modeling, you sort of take your traffic a little bit further, so you look at where are people going and coming to and going to and coming from, and what percentages. So this will pop up again once I finish with this slide. So there's typically 3 different scenarios, and the existing scenario is what is currently out there, what facilities are out there, what existing signals do we have? We provide any signal timing information to the consultant and have their traffic counts. The no-build scenario is what's happening in the future without this development. There is always a growth factor that is taken into consideration. Typically, our town is growing or developing, so we'll have some sort of growth rate. And then you'll add the traffic for the approved developments that have already been approved in the area. And then you will adjust the model for committed projects. So in this scenario, where the connector road had not been built yet, in the future no build for the project, it would have been considered complete. So in the no build scenario, that project would be complete. So then for the next scenario, yes?
Would you say that again, please?
Okay, so in the no build scenario, you would take into consideration any committed transportation projects. So depending on what the end of or build out year for that construction project, if the completion of that project is within this no build year, it would be considered existing or already there in that no build scenario. It wouldn't be in the existing, it would be in the future no build for 2022.
I was trying to shed something about even if Cornelius Road wasn't built. I'm trying, what was that reference about Cornelius Road being built or not built?
I'm sorry, if I say Cornelius Road, not Connector Road. In the
Or
example,
Connector Road, same thing. Cornelius Connector, yeah.
so in that example that I was showing before, when this subdivision came in, that road was not built yet. So in the existing condition, it would be considered not built. But in the no build, future no build condition, where the development would not be built, the road would be built. So in that scenario, and in the model, you would have that road there, which makes a difference because now you have more traffic coming from 115 over to Cornelius and able to move up to 21.
So with the build, and not knowing when that road may or may not be built, even though it's on a piece of paper, would it be included in that, the build with future development?
Yes, so
I think that's a problem.
NCDOT, right,
I think that's a problem.
it has become a problem for us in the delay of projects that we have been seeing. It has become a problem. And because this document is based on assumptions that we're making, the information that is shared with us on committed transportation projects, especially NCDOT projects, those timelines we rely on for these studies. And so it's really the only information we have to go off of, unfortunately. And now that we know that a lot of these projects are getting delayed, the subdivision gets built, you know.
Would that not be possible just to take that out? If you don't know what's happening, I mean, I built DOT. And say, well, we don't know, we just build it and then it comes. I've seen it happen all the time. And the flip side is you build it with the expectation it comes, but it doesn't come. And now you're stuck with something that isn't right.
So there are some projects where, for example, they've come in to scope a TIA since some of these delays have been happening. And the town has been aware, well, this project may or may not get built in this time frame. So in those situations, there has been an extra scenario built in, which is a build without the DOT project and a build with the DOT project. For that just in case scenario. On the other end, if that scenario was not built in on the front end, and there's a development where they were required to build something because there was a new road going to be there, or there was some assumptions made that affected the requirements of offsite requirements, they have the opportunity to come back and make, submit an addendum, some sort of document where, you know, they can amend some of their recommendations if some of those assumptions have changed. Sometimes it's on the developer side, they change their plan and they want to build less than they had originally proposed. Sometimes they want to build more than they originally proposed. They can, even when they're done with the process, they can come back later and we just require that they do some additional analysis, provide us with a technical document and some modeling that changes those assumptions, and then we can move from there. And then once, the last scenario would be the build scenario, which is the future with the development. And with that one, you are calculating what new trips are generated by that site that you're looking at. And then you would distribute those new trips across the study locations, which is back to this example. So,
Okay, now I have another question. So if you're building on 21, people are living on 21, they're going out, why are you taking into account, I guess that's your study locations, on the other side of I-77, all that traffic's gonna be on 21. More likely, I would think they're probably going down the Plaza Drive, and they're going out that way, unless, I don't know. That's what I would there.
so you're saying instead of,
Well, there's a big assumption that this traffic is pretty much being dispersed throughout the region. And I'm thinking as a person who lives on 21, I'm taking a route coming out and drop down 150 and come down that way.
Right.
And either guess go on Plaza Drive or continue on 21 down to exit 33. I doubt I turn up and go up to Vegas Road up there.
right,
Big
so
curve,
it's very hard to see, and I apologize for just how bad that figure is, but it's better on my paper here. So the portion, is this not a pointer?
Yeah.
Is that it? Okay. Right here is actually assuming 75%.
Right.
75% of people would go 150, like you said. And smaller percentages would be going in these directions. This one's actually 8% here. It's very difficult to see. So the majority, just like you said, the majority of traffic, and a lot of times it's based on, that distribution would be based on what the current traffic counts are and distributing those percentages on where people are already traveling. And then sometimes they can be a little skewed, so when the traffic consultant does submit their proposed distributions, if it's a little off just based on our local knowledge of where people are moving, then, it's not, abnormal for us to make adjustments if we feel like it's needed. Because this is what really, these assumptions affect the whole rest of the outcome of where the majority of traffic is going and how they're impacting adjacent intersections. So then, when they're finished with their analysis, they'll come out with recommendations. It's important to understand that the recommendations are based on the future no-build scenario compared to the future build scenario, rather than the existing to the future build. And the reason why that's important is because we are looking at the impacts of what this development has on the surrounding transportation network, and not necessarily what existing deficiencies are there, whether or not this development goes in. So it can be challenging in some ways to, especially if a developer is developing in an area that is already experiencing some heartache and traffic issues with congestion. If they're adding a small amount of site trips to that, we can't necessarily require them to upgrade the whole facility. It has to be within some reasonableness of the size of the development and the impacts that their development has. So I guess a simple way of saying it on my slide would be to bring the build scenario back to the no-build condition, the future no-build condition. And here's an example of how the intersection of Highway 21 and Cornelius in this TIA was affected. So I'm not sure if it shows it gray for you, but the gray here would be the existing delay. So these numbers here are seconds of delay at an intersection. And this would, so for example, if you are on Highway 21 and you are going north towards Troutman, right now at this intersection, you'd be waiting approximately 9 seconds. And then in the future no-build delay, it adds 14 seconds approximately. And then you can see in green here, the site, adding the site, it only impacts by an additional about 1.4 seconds, 1.5 seconds. So you can see how each leg of the subdivision of the intersection would be impacted, which phase it would be in, and how impactful it would be to that intersection. Anyone have any questions at this point?
So if you took away the future at that 13.8, then you'd have a 1 second delay. I mean, that way to look at it, is that 1 more second, 2% out the traffic light?
Yes, so if you're, I
But
think.
take away the future, you say we're building development right now, and it adds 1.4 seconds, is that what that is, on the very top?
So what this is saying is this site alone in the future year, which could be today or maybe last year when it was finished developing, in the future year, the delta or added time to wait at that intersection would be 1.5 seconds. Whereas if this development was never built, those 13.8 additional seconds would still be happening.
Well, the reason I ask that, all kinds of people come and they say, well, you know, that there's more traffic. You know, they just say, well, that development's gonna put more traffic. And so, you know, just thinking cars. So if we said we started tomorrow and they went it down and planned it tomorrow, it's only at that 1.4 seconds. Goes there for 500 houses or whatever, I mean, whatever the number is.
Right.
Because the future is in the future, but the
Right.
houses are static.
If you could build something tomorrow and have it there, there might be some variation on what that number would be, but it would be, the percentage would be the same. It would be a very small percentage because of how little trips are being added to the facility. So then from the recommendations, with the added delay, how can you improve the intersection? You can add turn lanes. You can, if it already has a signal, which in this case it does, you can have signal modifications. You can adjust the signal timing. You can redesign the intersection. You can adjust access points. And there's also a crash analysis that is included in the TIA, and that is just to evaluate from a safety perspective, not purely looking at capacity and congestion, but from a safety standpoint, would adding traffic at a certain intersection, would it make a certain known safety issue worse? And then this is within reasonableness. We cannot require the correction of existing deficiencies. The improvements must be reasonably attributable to the traffic using the driveway, and that's a general statute. So once this is submitted, the NCDOT will review it and the town will review it as well. The reviews happen concurrently, but they are separate. So a lot of times, town staff will have separate comments than NCDOT. And there may be, in some cases, if it involves a school, much larger impact traffic-wise to an area. Sometimes NCDOT will send their TIs to a section called congestion management, which this TIs are of their bread and butter. They do the traffic analyses for SIP projects and things like that. So if the project is big enough or complicated enough, then DOT has their own internal group that helps with those reviews. And then the last step is final concurrence. The consultant will update the report if there's any comments from the town or DOT, and then we'll provide concurrence, or if there needs to be any revisions, we will. And the last step is for drafting and signing of the mitigation measures agreement. This is a document that lays out all of the required mitigations, on-site, off-site, anything that we know needs to happen, when it needs to happen, determines phasing. Sometimes, for example, if there is a possibility of a need for future traffic signal, those types of improvements may be bonded, just because of the way that traffic signals work. They have to be warranted, and sometimes there's a little more that needs to happen after the fact, so sometimes there will just be a bond associated with those types of improvements, and noting any other comments or conditions. And then this is just an example just to show you for the Park Lot subdivision what their improvements were, and it was a northbound left turn lane into their site. So implementation, the applicant is responsible at that point for those mitigations. They will include them in their designs. They also will attach those to their concept plan before they come to you all and the town board for approval. So like to have the offsite improvements on there. I don't know if every time that they necessarily have them on there, but at least the mitigations will be typed out exactly as the agreement is written. And then during construction, DOT will have a copy of all of that when they go for their driveway permit. And the town also keeps track of anything that would have been tied to, if it's residential, typically tie it to platting of lots. And commercial sites, really the only thing to tie those to is the CO. And that is the end of my presentation. If there's any questions, any part of the presentation, let me go back to. It may be confusing.
Going back to the discussion we had coming in, what safeguard is in place to keep a developer taking a turn lane that's supposed to be extended 50 feet, extending it 3 feet, resurfacing the road and make it look like it's extended? Somebody go back and measure these turn lanes?
Yes. So if they're, the improvement that you're talking about is on an NCDOT road, so any of the off-site required improvements from the TIA, those will be handled through the NCDOT driveway permit. And the developer will submit those plans to NCDOT. If there are any issues or additional right-of-way would need to be acquired to achieve those offsite improvements, then there has to be some coordination between the developer and the property owner of any of those areas in order to achieve that improvement. If there's not an agreement on any of that process, and DOT and the town are not involved in any of that process, that is it's purely a private development, and that's their coordination to achieve those recommendations, then they come back to NCDOT and the town, give a status on, they'll typically give a status update on the progress of the construction in different stages. And if there is an inability to complete a mitigation on any TIA, then we come back to the study and evaluate, are there any, well, first they'll go to the end, is there any other way that that improvement could get built? It would be preferred, so if there's would be a widening or something, or an added lane, it's preferred to do it symmetrically. So sometimes there's ways to squeeze something in if it needs to be extended, kind of, if you're ever driving down the road and all of a sudden it kind of turns a little bit, it kind of tried to squeeze something in. If that can't be done, then there would be a request from the developer to see if there's any way that a mitigation could get reduced or maybe taken off, which does happen, and sometimes it can and sometimes it can't. Typically what we will look at is how much delay required that offsite improvement. There's a lot of different ways that mitigation agreements can get amended. And it's not always having to have technical information, but if something just purely cannot happen, and at the end of the day, it's an NCDOT road, so if they're okay with that improvement not happening, they can make that determination. But normally we like to have some sort of technical backing to say, well, you know, technically by our policy, this extension of 50 feet was required. When you peel through the details, it really only added maybe 4 additional cars to that turn lane, so it's not really necessary, so it can, you know, town, are you okay with it? Yes. DOT, are you okay with it? Yes. So we're okay with amending that and letting this project move forward.
I think I have another question. Same road, West Waterland, the speed limit is 55. Come down from 115, it's 35. Across 21, speed limit is 55. There's 286 new apartments. School's down, that road has 2 sharp curves and ends at Lake Norman. Who do you seek out to get the speed of that road over to some reasonable speed, which would be 35?
For any road that you would like to propose a speed reduction or an evaluation of speed, you go to the owner of that road or whoever maintains it. So in that case, it would be NCDOT, or if it's a town road, then you would make that request to the town and it can be evaluated. It's not abnormal for a town resident to send me an email, even if it is an NCDOT road, and then coordinate with NCDOT as well to make that request on their behalf.
I got it with you next week, 2 weeks from now, you can put me in touch with the person I'm.
Absolutely, and I'm making a note right now, so by the time to follow up with you, I may already know you. Is there any other questions?
Does anybody ever go back and look at the TIA after development is already built out, actually sort of do a study to see if the impacts that were anticipated actually happen?
So we have gotten that question before, and we have not, but it's difficult. I don't know if it's possible, because in order to do that, you would need to have both scenarios happen, which is a future no build and a future build. And both of those scenarios can't happen at the same time. So you could compare the future build, there might be some variances to the assumptions that may not have happened exactly. If you had a growth, you assumed that the annual growth of the town was actually larger than it was. There's a couple of different varying assumptions that would affect that outcome, but I have gotten that question before, and I've given it some thought. I know we haven't, but in actually trying to figure out how we would do that, and have it be accurate, just with all of the assumptions that are being made, I'm not sure if we actually could, to be honest.
I see it more as an art rather than a science, especially because each TIA stands on its own. So what might be going on a mile away or half a mile away can impact all of those intersections and its traffic flows. So I'm just trying to get my head around it. It's very interesting.
Yes, it is much more theoretical than it is, like you said, a science, and based on, it's based on actual data that you're collecting, but there are a lot of assumptions being made, and depending on who is conducting the TIA from person to person, engineer to engineer, those outcomes could vary. The modeling and the standards kind of keep them within a certain limitation, but one may assume 10% of the traffic went to Perth, and another may assume 5%, and that would change the numbers, and may not, in this case, affect the outcome of needing just a left turn lane into the subdivision, but on larger impact projects, that variability could make a difference of a 50-foot extension or 100. It's definitely, I would agree with that comment, more of an art than a science, and there's some theory to it, and reliance on the modeling software.
Any additional questions from the board?
Yeah, I got another. So, this project we had tonight, I think that's a pretty good one, because it's below the threshold, but it's also tied in with future, like the other development behind it, and the one right to the south of it. So is there any way, rather than just threshold, or any, I don't know what the term is, something to grab things that might be an issue, whether you're putting in a 45 unit subdivision on the road that's totally stopped up at 5 o'clock and nobody moves, but it's below threshold, so you don't need TIA, so they just build a development out. Or in the case of what we see tonight, where it's a small development, but it's tied to a pretty big development just to the east of it, with another place coming into it, it won't require TIA, but once they finish out those road connections, which to me makes it a cumulative project now, then now you have access to roads that are not accounted for.
So your question would be,
Well,
even if a development was under our minimum thresholds, may they still be required to do a TIA?
Yeah, based on some specific conditions of that project. You say, well, I got 5,000 homes behind you, you'll connect it to the road. They come left rather than right because it's closer, so now you may be a 35 unit house, but really I got another 600 coming left. And there's no way to grab that to account for that increased traffic that's going to go through that road, because they're utilizing the same road net. You're correct, you're requiring them to connect. So that ought to be taken into account when they develop up.
Right, and the distribution, those percentages of where traffic's going, traffic is definitely going to use that neighborhood. So that is taken into consideration from an initial on the front end of requiring a TIA. Each project that comes in is considered separate and its own project. So if a commercial site just got built, and then another commercial site got built right next to it, didn't require a TIA, but it's added on to another one, they would be considered completely separate. and subdivisions as well. If,
But they're adding on to a public road, so it seems to me there'll be some kind of public to say, well, yes, I understand that you're adding on to a public road, but you're now affecting everybody that drives that road, so I understand the separate project concept. I'm just saying, there's not a way, in some instance where it only makes sense, not put our blinders on and say, well, you're 10 houses, or you just don't meet our threshold, so it's okay.
yes, so I think, one example is maybe Kennerly Avenue, which is an existing DOT road before, the Gamble Forest subdivision started building there and came through. It was, had a certain capacity, it was built to a certain standard, the lane widths were much smaller than what the minimum DOT standard is today. The Gamble Forest community that is adding, I forget how many homes it was, close to 400, 500. Is that right? Maybe 400. One of their site entrances was identified as existing, or Kennerly Road is a main access into there, so DOT, when that developer applies for the driveway permit, or I'm sure they knew when they were going through the TIA process, DOT says, you're going to need to upgrade this facility because you're adding quite a bit more vehicular traffic to it. This needs to bump up to our minimum standard. That road gets upgraded, based on what that site is adding. If a site is smaller, doesn't require TIA, and it's not adding much, but it's in an area where there is a lot of congestion or it may cause a safety issue, we do have other thresholds in our TIA policy, it's not purely the 100 peak hour or 500 daily trips. If, like for example, if it has a drive-through facility, automatically, it doesn't matter what the square footage is, it's required to conduct a TIA. If there are safety issues that could occur with the way the site plan is laid out, or in an area where there's an existing safety issue, then I would probably recommend a TIA be completed even if it was under the thresholds. So there are some other minimum thresholds in the policy. There's probably about 7 or 8 of them that explain even if you don't meet these other ones, we could still require it under certain conditions.
I'm gonna ask this I'm gonna make a statement, but I'm gonna ask the question at the same time. I think to your question, Alan, even though this development that you saw tonight did not have to do with TIA, they still got to apply for a driveway permit with NCDOT because the tie-in is to Highway 21. And there is an opportunity when DOT reviews that driveway permit, they could still, as a condition of that driveway permit, get some turn lane or something like that. So they're not necessarily off scot-free if they don't have to do a TIA. And now I'll turn and ask you if that's right.
Yes. Yes, so in some situations, sometimes if I'm on the fence of whether or not one might be needed, and I have a sense that it might just be site entrance related, then in my mind, I understand, okay, this is gonna be covered in that NCDOT driveway permit, and if the turn lane is needed, it will happen there, and then DOT will evaluate, is there enough site distance, is it an appropriate area?
Any other thoughts, comments, or questions? I just have one quick one. Who makes the determinations, or who best influences pedestrian accessibility? Does that come through town channels or direct to DOT? And how do you get some of those items added into additional road improvements?
for new development on
Correct.
site.
Or even existing, where you're looking to add greater pedestrian accessibility, utilization, whether it is biking, walking, and so forth. I'm just curious, do we have an opportunity to better develop those as roads are repaved, redeveloped, or not? We're pretty much stuck with what we have.
So I'm gonna break up my answer in a couple different segments. So as it relates to land development and private development that comes in, there are requirements for them to install sidewalks on both sides of the street within the internal subdivision. And with our One Mooresville plan, we do have greenways and multiple, we should call them shared use paths, a plan that's shows a general location, but if it runs through where development is being built, then they'd be required to put in a wider sidewalk that would be utilized as future multi-use path connection for the community. And then along any existing roads, they are required to put sidewalk along the frontage of that road, of where their property touches. So that is a requirement for any other town projects. The paving, whenever any paving happens, there's some requirements that you might see, some related, maybe of existing sidewalk ramps or things like that might get adjusted. Typically not with repaving would you have sidewalk installation, but there's the 5-year CIP project where you have projects like McClellan Avenue that got built, or the upcoming Wilson Avenue project, where those are bigger roadway improvement projects where Wilson Avenue actually will have a multi-use path on the golf course side, on the south side of the road, that will extend from the golf course all the way into downtown. So those types of projects, we're really trying to get more of those projects. I think there's much more awareness and desire for those facilities. So anywhere that myself or Eric Martin, who's the transportation planner, anywhere where either of us can see an opportunity to maybe get a facility added, even on the NCDOT projects that we don't manage, but they ask us for our input for, as best we can, trying to getting those bike ped facilities as part of those projects. And the town staff boards have been in support of providing additional funding that are funding matches that the town provides to get those added facilities. So we just need to get projects built, DOT projects built, because the town's building our projects.
Well, thank you very much for that. I didn't mean to belabor time, but appreciate that. Been noticing, it's, it may be in conjunction with this pandemic that's going on, but I see so many more people out utilizing sidewalks and pathways, and it's nice to see the activity and folks out. And I was just curious, if that's something that we can continue to grow and expand. But thank you very much for the time tonight, and taking time out of your evening to help us with this. I think we're always presented with a lot of questions and challenges, particularly in this area. It's always nice to get these refreshers like you were talking about. We appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Okay, with that, are there any additional staff comments?
No, sir.
How about any board comments or recommended additional or future training sessions right now?
I have one. Out in California, they used to have brown house, and now they have a black house. The other company would put their lights on, turn everything on, and set the thing. I'd like to know what our capabilities are, to get the water out of the top of may we never hear. And if the town continues to grow, someday we're gonna run out of something. We're already out of roads. Just future session, I'd like somebody to tell us what our capabilities are and how do we measure up currently. What's left. I'd like to, there's only so much water goes down the river.
Well, that's a good thought process on resources, and it's nice to know, where those things might be. It's a good thought. With that, then do we have a motion to adjourn?
I move we adjourn. Second.
We have a motion and a second, all in favor?